Hello and welcome to the Novara Media General Election Manifesto Deep Dive with me, Ash Sarkar, and the incomparable and exceptionally well-briefed Aaron Bastani. Aaron, are you feeling excited?
I'm feeling very excited. This is all a prop. This is actually various takeaway menus that I've been amassing over the last several months.
He's actually got a Sudoku hiding underneath there. So obviously we're unable to talk about all of the manifestos in detail. So we've narrowed it down to the Tories, Labour, the SNP, Lib Dems, Greens and Reform. So sincerest apologies to the parties of Northern Ireland and Plaid Cymru. But them's the breaks. I'm sorry. What can I do?
And the Workers' Party.
And the Workers' Party. Oh my God.
George won't be happy.
He's going to be angry at me again. So I thought that maybe what we could do to start is maybe offer the briefest of sound bites on each manifesto. So maybe I could kick off with the Tories, seeing as they're the current government. What's really interesting is that the only area where they're truly propositional is on tax cuts. That's all they've got to offer. So they're offering tax cuts willy-nilly, cut in national insurance. And other than that, the other sort of key components that they're going hard on have been transphobia, the idea that biological sex is what's going to define people's gender rather than their chosen gender, and of course national service for 18-year-olds. But it's really not a lot to go on. What do you make of the Lib Dems?
The Lib Dems are much for muchness. And the forward, Ed Davey, who, for people who aren't aware, is their leader, he's kind of like a Keir Starmer, but from Shine or one of these Chinese websites, which are all incredibly valuable. In the forward, Ed Davey lists a bunch of bad stuff and then says it's time for change. The problem for them is, of course, lots of the bad stuff is a result of Lib Dems in government. However, there are some really interesting, some good policies. Just a few. One is that they would have a 20% higher minimum wage for people on 0 hours contracts. Very good. Apprentices to be paid the national minimum wage from day one. They would give votes at 16. But strangely, they will ban imports from Xinjiang or anywhere with egregious abuses. Now, you might say, well, that's good. A trade war with China probably wouldn't be very good for inflation in the UK. They also want us to rejoin the single market.
Let's go on to Labour. So unless you've been living under a rock for the past few weeks, you know that Labour have been trumpeting that their manifesto is fully costed. Rachel Reeves, she's a serious bean counter and she's been crunching the maths. So this is, as we're going to discuss in just a second, a very, very small c conservative manifesto when it comes to borrowing, taxation and spending. They're trying to do a lot with the word reform, saying, well, we can reform public services rather than spending too much money on them. And the biggest expenses are with regards to the Green Prosperity Plan, formerly known as the Green Industrial Revolution. It includes a National Wealth Fund, Great British Energy, and various infrastructure projects. But we don't know how much of those infrastructure projects will be carried out by the public sector, how much will be privatised, how much could be a PFI kind of deal. Other than that, they're promising to cut waiting lists, to utilise the private sector more with the NHS to bring down those waiting lists, and do something, but they don't say what, about staff retention in the public sector. So I think we're going to talk about what they don't say, because in some ways that's more important than what they do say. Let's go on to the Greens.
The Greens. It's funny about the staff retention thing in the NHS or anywhere in the public sector, because they all talk about it. The Lib Dems say the same. They go, okay, well, how are you going to pay for this? Not a peep. On the Greens, I would say that Reform, Labour and the Tories have their own different growth models. As much as I like the Greens, they haven't really got a growth model. It's almost like Liz Truss never happened. It's almost like we can keep borrowing cheaply forever. This could have been written in 2019. That's the first thing. Secondly, very ambitious, 150,000 new social homes a year, £40 billion investment per year in the shift to a green economy, a wealth tax of 1% annually on assets above 10 million, and a 2% on assets above 1 billion, a reformed capital gains tax so that aligns with income tax. Here's the thing, I think Labour are going to do that anyway, but at least the Greens are being honest about it. On climate change, winds provide 70% of the UK's electricity by 2030. Strangely not that ambitious. Delivery of 80 gigawatts of offshore wind, 53 of onshore wind, and 100 gig of solar. Why have I said those numbers? They probably don't mean anything to anyone. It's because nobody else has been that specific about what renewables would look like. And then finally, something I really disagree with, phasing out nuclear energy, which, given it's zero carbon and we need to reduce CO2 emissions, is insane. It's one thing to say we don't want to build any more. It's another to say we want to get rid of it.
Let's talk about the SNP. What for me is so interesting about the SNP is that they run their general election campaigns like they're insurgents, but actually, as you see, whenever there's a Holyrood election, they are fighting it as incumbents. And I think that's a very difficult position to be in. Their key pledges, of course, are around independence. They're promising a second Indie ref for Scotland. There's not very much clarity about how they're going to do that, but obviously if they win a majority of the Scottish Westminster seats, they'll interpret that as a mandate for a second independence referendum. And other than that, they're kind of pitching themselves to the left of Labour. Of course, they've got some things they can point to and say that their record puts them to the left of Labour. Free personal care for everyone in Scotland being one of those pledges. But other than that, it's saying they'll protect the NHS from both austerity and privatisation. They're going to reverse the £1.3 billion capital budget cut, which was imposed by Westminster. And crucially, they want to rejoin the EU. Now, I know you've been keeping a close eye on this party. What about reform? It's not even a manifesto, Aaron. It's a contract.
It is a contract. I should say the Greens also want to join the EU. Interesting. With reform, look, we can talk about how well they're polling, how many seats they're going to get. I actually think in some ways the most interesting thing about them is the manifesto. I said a few moments ago that only three parties have a growth model per se. The Lib Dems, meh. The SNP obviously don't have a growth model for anywhere outside Scotland. The Greens, it's like Truss never happened. They do have a growth model, and it's responding to post-Truss in a way. So the first point is that they're going to get people to pay a lot less tax. You would have the tax threshold go from what is presently, I think, around 12,800, God knows what it is, to 20,000. Now, that might seem like a huge push. Bear in mind, these have been frozen by the Tories, and because of inflation, actually, if that minimum tax threshold had kept up with inflation, it'd be around 16,000 anyway. So it's not as radical as it sounds. It will still cost a lot of money. There is a massive offer, really, to the petty bourgeois. There's an increase in corporation tax when that kicks in. There's an increase into VAT when that kicks in. So if you're a small business, that's great. There would be a online delivery tax of 4% on, quote, large multinational enterprises that would help save the high street.
It's an Amazon tax, basically.
Amazon tax. That would basically get rid of the business rates of small businesses on the high streets. They are talking really about what I called in an article I recently wrote, Gaullism meets GB News, because they think that utilities should be 50% owned by the taxpayer, the public, 50% owned by pension funds. On water, rail, I don't know about mail, and energy, there's no doubt about it. That is to the left of Labour.
So we've done the manifestos in brief. Now it's time to get deep, Aaron. Let's start by talking about tax and spend, how much money each manifesto has to play with. Now, what's really, really interesting is that today, on the day of recording this video, the IFS released a report where it slammed every single major party for being essentially dishonest when it comes to talking about its spending pledges, its taxation pledges as well. Now, that dishonesty, in their view, ranges from merely lies of omission, as with Labour, all the way to some pretty stern words that they have for both the Greens and Reform, interestingly enough. But let's start with Labour, because as I said, what they're not saying seems to me to be just as important or more important than what they've put in the manifesto. Because obviously, if you take them at their word in terms of this is how much things are going to cost, this is where we're going to borrow for capital investment, these are the new taxes that we're going to introduce, a windfall tax and scrapping the VAT exemption on private school fees, you go, oh yeah, this all makes sense. And then you go, well, hang on. One, because of inflation, you have to bring in more money to the Treasury just to keep up with where spending is right now, just year on year. The second thing is that we have got, between 10 and 20 billion pounds worth of cuts to unprotected budgets, which the government committed to just in March. What's Labour going to do about that? They've not said. They've said no return to austerity, but they've not mentioned anything about these cuts. And the third thing is what I said already, which is that it's likely a lot of the things that they say they're going to address, that's going to cost money. Now, they try and fudge that a bit when they talk about public sector pay. So they say, we're going to get round the table. We're going to negotiate like grown-ups. They talk about having a kind of, fair pay audit in the care sector. Now, talk is cheap. Paychecks are expensive. So it does seem to me they're leaving a lot out. I mean, what did you make about how Labour's tax and spend commitments compared to the other parties?
In a way, I agree with what the IFS is saying. Like, the Greens, I'm very tempted to vote Green, but the tax and spend commitments of the Greens are just outlandish. And that's before we're even they're talking about a UBI, a 4-day week. Like, it's outlandish. In a way, that's good. We need more outlandish, like, big picture stuff in politics. What Labour has done is, as like you say, a centre-right party. This reads really like a competent centre-right party in Europe, right? And the tax and spend stuff, for the most part, is there. They're not really going to raise anywhere near enough, as they say. I mean, their saving grace is they're being slightly more honest than the Tories. The fiscal rule is a big part of what this means. So debt, quote, must be falling as a share of the economy by the 5th year of the forecast. So by 2029, Britain's public debt needs to be falling as a share of the economy. Now, that can happen if the economy is growing really quickly. It's quite easy to happen, actually. If the economy isn't growing very quickly, that's incredibly hard. It means you have to have austerity. If the economy is just sort of bumbling along, 1%, So I think, frankly, Labour aren't being honest about the scale of what has to happen. I think we will see cuts in loads of areas. We would have to see cuts in loads of areas. Prisons, local government. They're saying, about the keeping people in the NHS, we would reduce reoffending. How? I mean, this is the thing in Labour's manifesto. We would reduce reoffending. We're going to spend less money on the prisons estate with inflation indexed. So how? By the way, it doesn't mean building more prisons. It will mean more prison guards. It will mean more education programs, literacy programs, whatever. Cost money. So, no, they're not being very honest. But like I say, the saving grace is that the others aren't either.
So let's talk about reforms, tax and spend, because that's really interesting. Like, some of these numbers that they're coming up with are just made up. For instance, we're going to talk about immigration in detail a bit later, but they say that their immigration pledges are going to save between 5 and 10 billion pounds a year. They've just completely pulled that out of their arses. But where they're planning on spending money and where they're planning on generating tax revenue is interesting, because each tax that they're proposing is telling a political story in itself. Now, it might not be one that I agree with. For instance, tax employers who employ immigrants. Well, that's the NHS on its knees then. But this idea of saying, all right, we're going to target this to do this, each one is connected to their central pitch about what's wrong with the country and what they're going to do about it. Speaking of spending commitments, why don't you make us one of yours? It costs a lot of money to run a media organisation, especially when we're having to employ someone just to fan my face in the studio because it's boiling. If you want to help us continue with our journalism, please go to novaramedia.com/support. We really do appreciate absolutely anything you can give us. We traditionally ask you for the equivalent of 1 hour of your wage per month, so we can keep working around the clock to bring you the kind of news, comment, and analysis that you just won't find anywhere else.
Ash, can I just add something to that?
Yeah, go on then.
The way I talk about supporters supporting Novara Media is I say, look, you have your direct debits at the end of the month. And then I think of my direct debits. RSPB, National Trust, all the woke organisations. Why not add Novara Media to that? National Trust, Novara Media. I can't think of two organisations better suited for one another.
I can't wait for the Daily Mail to go nuts about that.
In a way, you almost want Reform to do well. You almost want Reform to have MPs, right? You almost want the Tories to adopt a Reform-style agenda. People might say, that's mad, Aaron, crazy. How can you say that? By the way, I'm not suggesting anybody should vote for Reform. I'm not saying that for a moment. Here's the point. For 20 to 25 years, we've had the right say that we need to reduce immigration. There is only upside. There are no downsides. There are not costs and benefits, etc., etc. If Britain reduced immigration to the levels that Reform are saying we should, and by the way, we're a democracy. If most people want that, then obviously political parties in charge would have to enact that in a humane way, which abides by the rule of law. I did it slowly. But if you want to do that, it's going to mean lower growth, higher inflation, higher interest rates, bigger state, more taxes, right? And I'm sure some people say, I don't care. I don't like change. There are many people out there who vote Tory or Reform, and they would just say, look, I just don't like things changing. Fine. By the way, things would change because everything would become a lot more expensive. The point is that people like Nigel Farage and Reform have said for a very long time, we can have lower immigration, we can still keep cheap interest rates, we can have a smaller state, we can have lower taxes, we can have high growth. It's complete bullshit. It is complete bullshit. There are very significant costs to reduce immigration to the levels they want. And I actually think in a way, if they entered public office, we can have an honest conversation about that. Because my personal view is when people look at immigration in the round and what it means for all the things I just said, then yes, we can have a sensible conversation. And they will say, well, the left isn't willing to talk about immigration. You're not willing to talk about the costs of reducing immigration, particularly when the country's fertility rate is falling. Scotland's fertility rate, that's children per woman, say per household, but per woman, is 1.2. We are moving to the East Asian norm far more quickly than people realise.
The East Asian norm without East Asian infrastructure.
Yeah, or East Asian. Singapore on Thames, but we only mean the fertility rate. We don't mean GDP per capita.
I mean, so let's contrast some of the immigration pledges then. So you've got the Tories promising the Rwanda scheme. Now, that's just pie in the sky stuff. I think the reason why Rishi Sunak called the election when he did, one, because it was the equivalent of a one-way ticket to Dignitas for his political career. He just wanted this thing over. But the second thing is that I think that he knew that there was no possibility of getting Rwanda through the courts. It's just too flagrantly in violation of our international commitments to the Refugee Convention. So Rwanda is the main bit of their immigration policy. They do also have a cap. Now, Labour, interestingly, they don't put a number to immigration, but they do say they want to bring it down. So they want to scrap the Rwanda scheme. They call it a gimmick. They're not opposed in principle to the idea of third country processing, and they want to bring immigration numbers down. Now, how will they do that? Will it be by reducing the number of working visas offered? Would it be reducing the number of student visas? Would it be reducing the number of asylum applications which are granted? Would it be by increasing the threshold, the income threshold for immigrants even further? No idea. And then interestingly, you've got the SNP, the Greens and the Lib Dems all saying that either in the short term or the long term, rejoining the EU is a priority for them. The Greens and the SNP are very clear. That would mean freedom of movement. They're both very in favour of freedom of movement for EU citizens. The Lib Dems, I think that the bit which is tricky is that they say they want to rejoin the single market. Look, rejoining is going to mean accepting freedom of movement, which of course we didn't have before 2016. So taken all together, what do you think these manifestos tell you about where the Westminster consensus is on immigration?
Yeah.
Who's being realistic and who's not?
I think the whole rejoining the EU thing is insane, especially if you're left wing. Now, again, people might be saying, oh, what do you want about? My view is in the next parliament, we should join a customs union and we should be able to re-end things like Erasmus and whatnot. But rejoining the European Union would mean a few things. Firstly, we would need to adopt the euro. Secondly, if you're worried about the rise of the far right, I find it very strange to re-enter a political body whose driving force is Germany and France and Italy. Italy is run, the prime minister is on the far right. France, Marine Le Pen, looks on the cusp of power. The Rassemblement National, the Front National, are likely to be the largest party in the French parliament very shortly. And Germany's slightly different, but you've got the AfD getting record results and the CDU are likely to come back to power. So this idea that, if we rejoin the European Union, we will be not only a land of milk and honey and progressive values, but also, we can reopen our borders, have, migration galore. I think the nature of open borders and free movement in Europe, whether or not we're part of the EU, is going to shift so quickly. One party that did really well in the recent European elections, which was in government, was the Danish Social Democrats, who have an incredibly regressive migration policy. They did really well. Rassemblement National, they came first in France. The AfD did incredibly well. German party, Die Linke, which is basically, now that they've lost Sarah Wagenknecht, who has a different message on immigration, Die Linke have basically become the party of the professional managerial class and graduate of that future. They're literally not going to get 5% in the next election. So I think people who share those politics need to understand it's a tiny, 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 tiny subset of the overall population. And I think if you want to have a more progressive migration policy in this country, I certainly do. I think attaching that to rejoining or not rejoining the EU is really dumb. I think it's really stupid.
I mean, one of the things that I think is so fascinating about UK politics is that the Tories delivered Brexit. They're also being punished for Brexit in a way that, isn't happening with other parties. And one reason is because Brexit was this totem that people could project their own fantasies onto, right? It meant whatever you wanted it to mean. So for some people, that meant Singapore on Thames, it meant free ports. For other people, it meant, a kind of radical deregulation of various industries and the workplace. For others, it meant a possibility to have greater state intervention into the economy. And for everyone, there was a sense that immigration policy would change. Now, in a way, what we've ended up with, which is much lower EU migration, but much higher non-EU migration, that was always on the table. That's what people said by Global Britain. It meant you're going to have fewer Italians and more Indians. That's the deal.
Farage literally said this, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Farage literally said, we can have more people, from the Commonwealth. We have these historical relations. He literally said that. And now he's complaining about the outcome he was arguing for.
I mean, so just comparing Reform and the Tories for a second, of the two parties, is there any credibility on reducing immigration? Can the Tories or Reform, I guess, speak to right-wing voters and be trusted by them?
Well, here's the thing on migration, and it impacts Labour in particular because they're probably going to form the next government. It's going to massively fall. It's going to massively fall because of what the Tories have done with regards to spousal visas, a bunch of measures really, increasing the amount of money you need to earn in order to get a visa. It's now £38,000 plus. Crazy. Far above the median wage. So immigration is going to fall anyway. And you can bet your life, after 6 months in office, Labour will say, look, we've reduced immigration. So the Tories are going to reduce immigration. The question is, what are the impacts of that going to be for British higher education, the NHS, elderly care, social care? Probably not great. Also, this idea that you can't bring a spouse. I mean, if you're trying to attract people to do a PhD in nano, and I appreciate that's not most people migrating to the UK, but if you're trying to attract somebody to, do a PhD in nanotechnology at Imperial, they might want to bring their wife or husband, just saying. So, yeah, the immigration thing is interesting because it's falling. And we have to also be honest that after 2020, Britain saw record levels of migration. I think 1.3 million net in 2 years, partly because of Ukraine, partly because of Hong Kong, but also partly because, like you say, we left the European Union. And there was a complete lack of honesty about this. And I feel like the best counter-arguments right now, there's this pivot, isn't there? We need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. That's the new Brexit. That's Farage's new Brexit. The best counter-argument I can think of when you're talking to people saying we need to leave the ACHR is, well, hold on, you said we needed to leave the EU. That hasn't worked out. Why are you right this time? Because what would happen is we'd leave the ECHR, not much would change because we have the Supreme Court. That's what would happen. And then they would blame British judges, woke Supreme Court judges. So constantly blaming stuff on forces abroad is very easy politics, but on the execution it's quite hard because actually often that's not even the primary issue.
I'm going to move us on to health and social care because this has obviously been a really big part, I think, of the collapsing confidence of the Tory government. Obviously, Liz Truss, her mini budget leading to an increase in interest rates is a big bit of it, right? Because you lose an awful lot of homeowners. And the sort of consensus that had formed around austerity was protect house values, protect homeowners, make sure that credit is basically free and you can play vandal with whatever public service you want. Now that you don't have low interest rates, now that credit isn't cheap, the parlor state of public services matters a lot more. And I think one of the things that, maybe some of our viewers who live abroad might not realise is that we do have private healthcare in this country, but we don't have private healthcare for everything. So you don't have private healthcare for accident and emergency. You don't have private healthcare for intensive care. Why? Because these are things which are very, very, very expensive. And also you've got there's not a profit model of that. And not every private hospital facility will have a ward for every single thing. So for instance, not every private hospital will have a respiratory unit. They always have cardiology units because that hits your ideal age group of rich person. And it's serious enough to make people want to go private, but it's not so serious that it's going to kill you right away. So it means that everyone is going to come into contact with the NHS at some point if you've got health issues, right? So you can be the Duke of Westminster, or you could be someone who lives in Blythe Valley. You are going to have to walk through the doors of that accident and emergency. And that exposes you to what's been done to the healthcare system. So comparing the party promises on health and social care, what stands out to you?
Just firstly, in terms of what you said there, it's so true. And I find that as somebody who's a new dad, some of the horror stories about maternal care, and it really does, it goes beyond class and race. It is true that women of colour are more likely to be treated poorly in the NHS, but it's not limited to them. And I think it's something that's really radicalised lots of people very quickly in the last 10 years, actually. In terms of care, here's a policy I'll start with that's quite interesting, which nobody else talks about. I could be wrong. Is that the Green Party support a change in the law to legalise assisted dying for people suffering from terminal diseases. That's the first one. And that's not part of their elderly and social care thing. I thought I'd mention it because nobody else is. And that's quite a distinctive thing with the Green Manifesto. You read it and go, well, okay, look, you might not agree with everything in there. I don't, by the way. I don't agree with them on nuclear. I don't agree with them on the EU. I support HS2. But they have lines and they believe in stuff. That's the first point. More interestingly, though, on social care, they would push for an investment of £20 billion to introduce free personal care along the lines brought in by the Scottish government, increase pay rates and introduce a career structure for carers to rebuild the care workforce. Going to the Lib Dems, they say something quite similar. They would, I think, have a wage of £15, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. Minimum wage of £15 for care workers. And I think even the Labour Party is talking about sectoral bargaining in terms of the minimum wage with social care workers. So, I mean, that looks almost like a growing consensus, which is really promising, right? They disagree on a hell of a lot. But if the Lib Dems, the Greens and the Labour Party are all saying that, look, plausibly, we could have a higher minimum wage for people in the care sector than the rest of the economy. First of all, I think that's good. Because I like sectoral wage bargaining. The fact we're going to sectoral minimum wages blows my mind. I don't think these people realise how radical that would be. Anyway, but it's really, really positive. And of course, the Tories have nothing to offer. I
mean, talking about the Tories having nothing, obviously a big moment in the 2017 general election was when Theresa May said no one's going to have to sell their house for elderly care. You will recoup the costs from inheritance tax, basically. And this was badged by the left, people we know, dubbing it the dementia tax, saying, well, why is it that you've got to pay for your care if you've got dementia, but not if you've got cancer? Looking back on it, was that maybe the fairest policy proposal you were ever going to get from the Tories on sorting out elderly care?
Well, it would have worked. Is it fair? I don't know. I mean, I don't think that the idea that, because all of the wealth in this country is in people's bricks and mortar, it's in their housing assets. Lots of people haven't got a pension and aren't leaving anything to their kids. By the way, I'd have a very high rate of inheritance tax. So I'm not suggesting this is like, how I'd like to proceed. But I feel like, if you've got a £500,000 3-bed flat in Hackney and you want to leave something to your kids and grandkids, you should be able to, of course. But then if you've got dementia or Parkinson's, you're going to be punished for cognitive decline as opposed to heart attacks, cancer. So I do think the critique of the Tories there was legit. And by the way, dementia tax is a live thing for an aging population. Yes, of course, the median life expectancy stayed the same because of austerity, but more and more people are living older and older and older. The number one cause of death in this country for the best part of a decade now is dementia. So it's something we're all going to have to think about. The hallmark of a successful society is you will die of dementia, which is obviously not a nice way to die. Actually, probably dying of a heart attack's probably
there's a reason
quite nice
why they don't
that.
have that as like an inspirational quote, like live, laugh, love, like a successful society, you're going to die of dementia.
Yeah. Well, no, Japan's the great example. I think 1 in 3 people in Japan will likely die of dementia. And, that's the thing. We can cure cancer. This is all the charities, right? We can cure cancer. We can cure cardiac disease. We can cure. Great. We'll all die like at 110 of dementia. That's what winning looks like. And also very expensive, by the way. So just quickly, people say that, if you smoke and you drink, you shouldn't have NHS access. Those people are literally giving themselves health disorders. I don't want people to die of lung cancer or whatever, but my mum died of lung cancer. They're dying of things actually which are incredibly cheap to treat. Whereas if you're very virtuous, very good, you don't smoke, you don't drink, no fatty foods, you live to 100, and then you get dementia, that is the most labour-intensive, expensive course of treatment known to man. So that's just a stupid right-wing argument that has no basis in fact.
Wow, I'm going to take up crack cocaine use for the NHS. Just kill me off nice and young.
True, good argument.
So I went back and I compared Labour's 2024 manifesto to Labour's 2019 manifesto. Now, there are many differences between the two documents. In the latest manifesto, there's 32 pictures of Keir Starmer, not including the front cover, which seems a bit excessive to me. But a really profound difference was on the plans for social care. Now, there are things which Labour have committed to do. So having a fair pay agreement for the care sector, basically sectoral bargaining. That's a very big deal. When it comes to what the care provision is going to be, they suddenly come over all shy. So they want to embark on a process of reforms which could lead to the creation of a national care service. What that national care service is, who it's going to provide for and how, question mark. Whereas it was very, very clear in Labour's 2019 manifesto that the National Care Service was going to be a publicly owned and operated care service. It would resemble the NHS in lots of ways, free at the point of use, and that it would seek to double the number of free care packages available to people. So you'd have free personal care for older people, and for the population more broadly, double the number of care packages. That is just not the case here. The Lib Dems are promising to fund free personal care for older people out of an equalisation between capital gains tax and income tax.
Legit.
The Greens are talking about using a wealth tax to address the waiting list in the NHS. Labour, very weak in this area, I thought.
Yeah, so you mentioned the photos stat, which is quite funny, but also this is a PR document. This isn't an intellectual document. Now, why am I saying that? Well, the phrase "stop the chaos" is used 15 times. Turn the page is used 24 times. I proceed to actually literally turn the page. Yeah. Stop the chaos is used in regards to climate, the NHS, everything. So it's like, okay, I get it. Take back control. What was the other one? What was 2019? What was it again?
Get Brexit done.
Get Brexit done. There you go. These 3-word phrases. So turn the page, stop the chaos. I get it. But actually, look, this is the one opportunity where I get to read about what you're proposing to do in government. You get to literally rule 68 million people. It's kind of important we know what you've got planned. And it's not really there. And childcare is another one. I know we're not talking about childcare, but it's exactly the same story. Even the Tories, okay, they've not worked out how they're going to fund it. But importantly, there is 15 hours of free childcare for all kids above 9 months old introduced from September. That is happening. I know, because we got the codes to pay for it, my wife and I, last week. So that is happening. And the Tories are saying by 26, 27, it'll be 30 hours of free childcare. Labour aren't saying anything. They're just saying we'll improve childcare. Now, do I trust Labour to do a better job than the Tories? I do. But there's nothing actually there. And it's like you said, it's exactly the same with the NHS. We're going to work to retain staff. Like, okay, how are you going to pay them? Reform, incredibly enough, have a plan to, do I think this will happen, by the way? No. They would scrap student debt of all nurses and doctors. They say, if you work in the NHS for 10 years, we'll scrap your student debt. What a great solution to the issue of brain drain with regards to people going to Canada, the US, whatever, because they might work for 10 years in the NHS and say, you know what, I've now paid off my student debt. I will now go there. Fine, go ahead. But it's going to be 10 years. So, yeah, this is one of those things. I mean, I could talk about the Labour manifesto in a bunch of ways. The only thing it's really substantial on is setting up new quangos. There, I know everything we're going to set up these new bodies, and this is what they're going to do. But in terms of healthcare, in terms of new teachers, in terms of dentists, okay, there's some stuff on teachers, fine. It's not very much. I mean, on the quangos thing, maybe we can come back to that. But my thought in terms of Labour's growth policy is quangos and inshallah. That's it. We'll create 6 new quangos and, pray, and hopefully things will work out fine.
Let's come to work, housing and education, which I know is taking a lot of things and bringing them together. But, we've got limited time. Let's talk about the Conservatives. What's very, very striking to me is that their only offer for workers really is tax cuts. That's the only thing they're offering to you if you're a worker. They are pledging something like £12 billion worth of savings from welfare. Basically, what that means is you're going to have a much more punitive welfare system to try and encourage people who are unfit for work to work somehow, and to cut taxes for workers. That's sort of it. Labour, however, do have a workers' New Deal, which will strengthen the powers of trade unions. The Conservatives, meanwhile, want to extend minimum staffing requirements for strike days. Let's talk about Labour's New Deal for workers. Has it surprised you that it hasn't gone the way of Keir Starmer's other 10 pledges?
Not really, because there's nothing substantial there. It's a consultation, a review, and a right to work without being contacted by your employer, which isn't actually a right. So a right which isn't a right, a review and a consultation. And again, look, you could be very optimistic. By the way, why should a first-time Labour voter be optimistic and trust it? Why should they be optimistic? If you're a lefty and you're involved in all this stuff, you go, you know what? I trust Louise Haigh to do that. Yeah, okay, you're high information, great. Why would the average person trust them to do that? I actually find the Liberal Democrats on work, the policies outlined, are much better. And one is on popular ownership. Quote, encourage employers to promote employee ownership by giving staff in listed companies with more than 250 employees a right to request shares to be held in trust for the benefit of employees. Where does that come from? The 2019 Labour manifesto. On foreign takeovers, this is key. Extend the scope of the existing, quote, public interest test when considering approvals for takeovers of large or strategically significant companies by overseas-based owners to recognise the benefits of the UK economy, workers and consumers. So we wouldn't be selling off ARM to SoftBank or allowing it to relist in the US. We should have already be doing this. So on that stuff, actually, the Lib Dems are making better noises. I mean, like I say, if you're an optimist and you actually think that Keir Starmer probably will deliver some of those things, I think he probably will. I don't trust him very much. I probably trust him on that and maybe rail. Then fine. But no, there's not much there in black and white, which is substantial.
So this is something very interesting from the Greens. It's not been talked about that much publicly, which surprises me, but they would, if they got their way, introduce a 10-to-1 pay ratio. So what that would mean is that your highest paid person in any given organisation could not earn more than 10 times more than the lowest paid person in the organisation. Now, this seems to me to be a very sensible policy. I do remember that it was floated around as a Corbyn era proposal, but it's not something which seems to animate the press so much. They don't really like talking about that one.
I mean, it's kind of an insane policy.
Do you think?
Well, for the private sector, it's insane, surely. 10-to-1 for the private sector. For the public sector, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, private sector, that would mean Gin Ratcliffe as CEO of INEOS. And by the way, they would find ways to work around it with share buybacks and then companies held in trust, and they would pay themselves the dividends of that. This would be on salaries, presumably. 10-to-1 is not much. I mean, in the public sector, absolutely. But then somebody said to me, well, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which of course maximizes value for Norwegian taxpayers, done very well. It pays for their pensions and their pension liabilities. He is on, I think, he's on megabucks basically. So what? Should he's on let's say £800,000. I think it's more than that. he's on, I think, in excess of €1 million a year, maybe multiple millions of euros. Should then the lowest paid employee at this publicly owned sovereign wealth fund serving the public interest, should they be earning 1/10 of what he is, and therefore should they be on like 100K plus a year? And I'm like, okay, you got me. Okay, but there's very few examples of that. In the UK, the highest paid person in the public sector is, I believe it was the person who was at the top of HS2. There you go. And I think they were earning about 650, 700 grand. Yeah. So on HS2, obviously you should be having a pay ratio of 10-1. So are you paying the person who's earning the least on HS2 70 grand a year? If not, then that fucker, I'll use that word because they really fucked up the project. He will have to earn less, or she, because they should replace him with somebody else. So he's gone. So I think that's legitimate. I think as well with local authorities, you shouldn't have, head of child services, for instance, where I'm from originally, Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole. I think it's a unitary authority. Head of child protection is on like 200 grand there. You should not have people cleaning, right, the offices of child protection workers earning less than £20,000. And if they are, then that person needs to earn less and they should be earning more. And by the way, if you look at something like the Royal Navy or the US Navy or the Royal Air Force or the US Army, what are the pay ratios generally in very effective military organizations? 8-1. Why? Because if it's any higher than that, you get a real sense of disproportion and you don't have a literal esprit de corps. To have a esprit de corps in an organization, you need relatively flat pay structure. Now, like I say, in the private sector, how do you legislate for that? I don't think you can, because people will give themselves share buybacks, dividends. Look what Elon Musk's doing with Delaware right now, giving himself a bonus of like tens of billions of dollars. Shareholders have actually said, yes, okay, you've made me so much money. Tesla is so overinflated. I'm very happy for you to have that bonus. And I think it'd be very hard for government to interfere there. So I think in the public sector, 10-1, absolutely. I think in the private sector, look, the old ways are the best. Top rate of tax just needs to be a lot higher. That's how you would do it. That's how you claw a lot of that money back. So I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel on that one, but I would have it for the public sector.
Let's talk about housing for a second. So Labour has got a big top line pledge on house building. I think it's 1.5 million houses. But interestingly, no numbers on council housing or social housing. That was something which they were talking about in 2020, 2021. I guess that's gone the way of the dinosaur and Keir Starmer's 10 pledges. Their offer for renters, other than banning no-fault evictions, I'm sorry, it's a complete load of shite, other than banning no-fault evictions. They've said, okay...
Which all the parties are planning to...
Which all of them are, because it's a sort of easy win.
I mean, I can't actually... You tell me, because I mean, what's the difference between the Tories and Labour on renting?
Let me have a look. Let's see if Section 21 is... Yep. Tories are going to abolish Section 21 as well. That is
there you go.
Consensus. But when it comes to actual conditions that impact renters, I mean, the Labour Party are really, really bad. So the first thing they said is that they're going to try and get rid of bidding in the rental market. So what that means is a really common thing, particularly in big cities, is that prospective tenants are encouraged not to say, yes, I can meet the rental price that you have listed on Zoopla or Rightmove. They're encouraged to bid. So they'll say, okay, well, you say that this flat is £1,500 a month. Well, we can take it up to £2,000 a month, right? To encourage bidding wars amongst tenants. Labour have said, well, we want to discourage that from happening. How? Are you going to ban it? No. They said they're going to prevent estate agents from facilitating bidding wars between prospective tenants, but prospective tenants can do it voluntarily. What does that mean? You're still going to have bidding. Similarly, there's not going to be rent caps or rent freezes, but renters can challenge unreasonable rent increases. Now, renters at the moment can challenge unreasonable rent increases. It's just not going to get you anywhere. So the Labour offer on renters is terrible. It is only beaten for last place in rental offers by Reform. The first thing is that they want to make being a landlord more tax efficient. So restoring landlords' rights to deduct finance costs and mortgage interest from tax on rental income. They want to encourage smaller landlords into rental markets. Now, I'm not saying that it's better to have, massive landlords with corporate portfolios, but buy-to-lets are really bad for the housing market. They're really, really bad.
Well, if you believe in free market economics, actually, you do want economies of scale, which, you and I would say, the economy of scale should be...
The state.
Municipal ownership. But mum and pop, you want a good standardised product overseen professionally, which is hobbyists squeezing money out of renters, aren't that?
I've lived with small scale landlords before, and let me tell you, it was bad. I had one lady who just pretended not to speak English whenever I had a problem. So she could speak perfectly good English when it came to telling me how much the rent was or whatever. And then when I asked her to stop letting herself into the flat whenever she wanted, I was like, you have to give me notice and I get to say no. She literally was just like, I speak English. And I was like, you canny goose. Also, the Reform Party want to abolish the Renters Reform Bill. Existing legislation was inadequate to address bad practices. Instead, we will boost the monitoring, appeals and enforcement process for renters. Now, that's not bad, boosting enforcement of existing rules, but getting rid of the rules, terrible, terrible, terrible set of policies for renters. On education, does anything stand out to you?
Oh, does anything stand out to me? Well, I find it quite...
You're a parent, you want your kid to learn to read?
That's true. So Labour are, iconically calling for VAT on private schools, and this will pay for, I think, 6,500 new teachers in secondary schools. 45% of secondary schools in the UK in the last 12 months in maths have had to have teachers who aren't trained in maths teaching mathematics. That's a crazy statistic. And I've seen, credit to Keir Starmer, I've seen him doing the media rounds saying, look, I understand you don't want to pay VAT. There are parents out there that don't want a PE teacher teaching their kids maths. Okay, we have to have a trade-off here. And that's the centre of public opinion. We know that from the polling, by the way. Despite all the phone-ins and these parents whining, most people support this measure. It's perfectly reasonable. On the Tories' policies with regards to schools, they just say, look, we've done really well. This is when people say, what's improved over the last 14 years? The only thing Tories really say is schools, because PISA league tables, it's doing better in terms of the percentage of schools rated as outstanding. It's doing better. You can agree or disagree with that. But it's the one thing that they say, actually, we have a good record on this. Strangely, I didn't really find anything from reform around schools beyond the culture war stuff. We can talk about that more in a moment.
Yes, let's talk about the culture war stuff.
It's very interesting. And then I'll just say quickly, retention issues. It's just like the NHS. The Lib Dems, Labour and the Tories, but particularly the Lib Dems and Labour, because they're meant to be the serious progressive parties. They talk about retention, but they don't talk about how. We have a massive, massive problem in this country of young teachers, young health professionals leaving. It's going to get worse, by the way, because Australia's weather is a hell of a lot nicer and you can earn a lot more money. And I think in a more globalized world, the right has shaped the debate around immigration that, oh my God, people have mobile phones now in Sudan. They can want to come to the UK. Okay, maybe. Well, kids working in the NHS in Shropshire can also see how much better life is in Australia, Canada, the US. So we need, again, a big informed conversation about retention in these organisations. I think it's through scrapping student debt, but that they're not talking about it.
I think scrapping student debt is one factor. I think that pay is another. And then the other is, particularly for teachers, is that they're expected to do everything, all right? So when you've got a context of, increasing child poverty, and you've got parents who can't afford to wash their kids' school uniforms, well, that becomes a teacher's job as well. Yeah. It becomes a teacher's job to provide meals and snacks for kids whose parents can't afford to feed them at home. When you've got cuts to child protection, because don't forget, a lot of that comes from local authority budgets. Local authority budgets have been completely decimated under austerity. That means that comes back on teachers as well. And friends of mine who work in education, and I'm not just talking about secondary schools, because secondary schools, it's the job of a teenager to try and push a teacher to the point of nervous breakdown. Not proud of it. It's what teenagers are like. What friends of mine who are teaching at primary school level are saying is that they're finding a lot more children with serious behavioral issues, serious problems of socialization, serious mental health issues and learning difficulties. And the expectation is that you've got this newly qualified primary school teacher who has to deal with all of it because you don't have other services which are functioning well enough to kick in.
So Labour now, let me channel Bridget Phillipson. Labour would say, Ash, I couldn't agree more. That's why we're introducing breakfast clubs. By the way, again, as a new dad, I get the kid out of the door as quick as possible. I want to watch my football highlights in the morning. Get
You're like chucking your baby like a rugby ball.
Go to the breakfast club. So there's breakfast clubs, and also they want to massively fund and improve mental health services in schools. Look, we can criticise Labour for other things, but that seems very good. And the Tories, they have their own solution, of course, to mental ill health amongst young people or behavioural issues. It's to ban mobile phones. By the way, I have no issue with, there are pilots out there that suggest that not having mobile phones in schools are good. But the idea, it's really, really conspicuous in the manifesto. It's like the cornerstone pledge of their offer. We will ban mobile phones in schools. Okay, well, that shows how little you have to offer elsewhere.
This is something that makes me feel really old because when I was at school, you weren't allowed a mobile phone at school and they came around with like a big plastic box and you had to put the phone in there. I didn't know that kids were suddenly allowed.
See, it seems crazy to me, but there are some people on Twitter, like Ian Dunn, the liberal guy, he's like really passionate about kids being able to have mobile phones in class.
Why?
What are you talking about? You're there to learn. Anyway,
Look,
now
man,
I'm getting old.
Like kids work hard. They'll cyberbully at home. Don't worry about it. Let's talk about the culture wars element of education because this is so fascinating to me. We know that the Conservatives have been leaning so hard on transphobia. All right, that's truly their stanner lift to greatness. They hope it's going to carry them up there, and so they promise that every parent will know what's in the curriculum being taught to their child. What that means is that the PSHE content, or is it PSHE? I don't know. PSHE is what we used to call it in my day. Maybe I'm old. That the teaching material around social issues, gender and sexuality will be subject to parental scrutiny. In effect, that means religious scrutiny. They're not really worried about what kids are being taught in English literature. Like, I really hope you do Tess of the D'Urbervilles this year. It's not really about that at all. And they say that we guarantee that the contested concept of gender identity is not taught to children. Now, this to me sounds completely bananas. And this is what I find so funny about transphobic so-called feminists, is that they go from saying there's a relationship between gender and biological sex, and you can't just remake that however you want. I disagree with how they think about that, but I'm like, okay. And then they go, gender identity doesn't exist. I'm like, it plainly does. It just plainly does. So yes, the Conservatives will be promising you that your child will not learn about the existence of transgender people. And Reform, as well as going hard on the transphobia, they say, any teaching about a period or example of British or European imperialism or slavery must be paired with the teaching of a non-European occurrence of the same to ensure balance. Now, what they're getting at here is...
I think that's great, by the way.
But,
teach 9-year-olds about the Safavid Empire, please. by all means. Teach them about, Aurangzeb and Akbar Shah and the Mughals, please, and the Gunpowder Empires. I don't think that's what they mean.
No, that's not what they mean. What they mean is Arabs and Africans did slavery too. That's what they mean. And of course, there was a slave trade.
But teachers wouldn't operationalise it like that. Teachers would operationalise it in a thoughtful, intelligent way, and they'd even be even more angry.
That would be hilarious. The thing which I also find funny is that...
You want to teach history about brown people in your Reform? It's so strange.
Any example of European imperialism. So when you're teaching about the Nazis, you then have to find an example of that happening in a non-European context. I'm sorry, that...
Kind of hard.
That was the Europeans doing it elsewhere.
Well, I suppose you could say with the Safavids, what was his name? Nader Shah, when he did the sack of Delhi in the 18th century. This is what we're going to apparently... If Farage is PM, this is what we're going to teach 11-year-olds. When Nader Shah did the sack of Delhi, he brought loads of people back from, Hindustan. And it's called the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan because it means the Hindu killer. in Farsi because that was the route they'd bring them through as slaves. So look, if Farage wants to teach this alongside like the Battle of Trafalgar, I mean, I find that kind of weird, but okay, it's interesting.
I mean, is this really, do people genuinely get excised about this stuff, or is it just about people who are very politically engaged and feel very strongly that they shouldn't be made to feel bad about slavery? Who's this for?
I think Farage put it well in his video where he said, I'm sick of children being taught that like Britain's the worst country ever. Now, of course, if children were being taught that, I mean, I'm sure many people would be sick of it. The point is they're not being taught that. And I think the people that are angry because they're under a misapprehension. And it's the same with the National Trust, right? I went to the National Trust. I went to Mottisfont in Hampshire recently. Lovely gardens, rose garden there. And, it was the first time.
Your 40s have changed, you.
Oh, it's really nice there. We saw a Lowry and we saw a Barbara Hepworth, is it?
Oh,
and they weren't particularly well guarded. I said, come on, if you wanted, you could pinch that, But the point is, very high trust. We left the baby's pram outside because you couldn't bring the pram inside. And we come back 20 minutes later, it's still there. Now, if you were to listen to like Farage and Tice, lawless Britain, it's going to be stolen. No, lots of the country still looks like 60-year-old women who could be transplanted immediately into a Jane Austen novel or whatever. That's still like 80% of the country, right? But if you go if you go into a primary school in Southampton, it looks kind of different. Guess what? History's always been like that. Like, you will have pockets of things that look very differently. And yes, the country will look very different in 50 to 100 years. That is nothing new. So besides name dropping the National Trust, I did that because these same people who are at war with like woke schools are also at war with like the RNLI, the National Trust, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. You're waging war on Middle Britain. Do you understand what you're doing? It's so strange to me. But they don't view them as part, and probably rightly, they don't view them as part of their coalition, strangely. They're like, join the Lib Dems, join Greens, join Labour. It's more about former Red Wall, like blue-collar people, or Tory voters in the Red Wall, former Tory voters in the Blue Wall, who are just more socially conservative, who've always been more socially conservative. So it's a very strange mix.
Seeing how that one plays out is going to be really interesting. I want to talk about Scotland for a second. So another independence referendum has been ruled out in the Tory manifesto, the Labour manifesto, and the Lib Dem manifesto. Reform don't even mention Scotland once in the entirety of their manifesto. They only make some passing references to Wales, nothing about devolution. It's basically like, Wales exists. Other than that, Nigel Farage, he wrote an article for The Scotsman where he said, we don't believe in independence. Silent on the issue of a second independence referendum. Before we get to the SNP, do you think that the Westminster parties are in denial about the strength of feeling around Scottish independence, or have they called it right?
Well, there's a counter-argument which says, look, if you think that, how many seats are there in Scotland? 59?
Let me have a look.
Boundaries are being redrawn on that. I think it was 59 prior to that. High 50s. The counter-argument is, well, if you get less than 50% of...
57.
57. Was it 59 before, or...?
It may have been.
Okay, well, whatever. High 50s. And before people get upset with me, and Scots, I don't know how many seats there are in England in this election either. There you go. So it's equality of ignorance. If you had, less than 50% of seats not voting for the SNP, is that an indication that people don't want independence? I recognise the right to self-determination for anyone, including Scots, but I do feel like they've wasted their political opportunity. I could be wrong. I talk to Scots about this all the time. I'm very interested in the politics of devolution and independence, particularly in Wales, because it's less covered. And I feel like they dropped a ball. And we'll never know quite what happened. But between 2014 and 2019, in a way, maybe Brexit makes it even harder for them, counterintuitively. Because initially, of course, everybody said, well, Brexit means that we'll now have to leave the UK because we want to stay in the EU. But do Scots really want to leave the Union to join the EU, to adopt the euro? And is that more sovereignty? By the way, I don't think it's more sovereignty. So it's an interesting one. Another word that's not mentioned in the Reform Manifesto, besides Scotland, is the deficit. And when you think about the 2015 election, those were like the twin the twin obsessions of the right, Scotland and the deficit. And so, yeah, it's interesting that reform hasn't really talked about either.
I mean, talking about the SNP, I mentioned earlier that I do think it's very challenging for them that when it comes to Westminster-focused politics, they present themselves as insurgents, right? They present themselves as progressives who are trying to steer the country towards the centre-left. But when it comes to Scottish politics, they're, of course, having to defend a record as incumbents, which puts them in an uncomfortable proximity with the Conservative Party in a way. You have to keep pointing to the things that you've done, even when people can see declining living standards all around them. And sure, the SNP say, well, this is all the fault of Westminster. If we were an independent nation and we could, take our own destiny into our hands, we could fix all these things. Maybe there's some truth in it, but it's a hard drum to beat for over a decade, which is we're going to take credit for all the good things and we're going to shift the blame for all the bad things. I guess I've got two questions for you. One is there actually a viable path for the SNP for a second independence referendum when almost every other Westminster party, apart from the Greens, is ruling out a second independence referendum? And is progressive civic nationalism in retreat more generally?
Such a great question. I feel like this 2024 election is a huge inflection point for so much. And in a way, I don't think civic nationalism's over. Of course it's not. And I don't think the cause of Scottish independence is over. It still polls incredibly well by historic standards. It still polls regularly in the mid-40s, which is far higher than it was at any point between basically the Act of Union and 2014. So it's not over. And, Labour, even if Labour came back, I think some polling shows the SNP winning 15 to 20 seats. That's still extraordinary, right? From a nationalist party, and you have your ebbs and flows. And if that's the low tide after the years they've had, that's still a very good result. But I do feel that post-war in Ukraine, post-COVID, cost of living crisis, I feel like people are more worried about risks and downsides than they are about opportunities and upsides. And that's just a vibe shift. That's just a change in the structure of feeling. So I think they have a harder sell. And of course, the SNP had unique political leverage under conditions of a hung parliament. So it's no coincidence that they really saw their breakthrough 2010 to 2015, because you have a hung parliament in 2010. You don't have a majority government. And you have in 2015 expectations of a hung parliament, or a very close election, where it was. But people generally thought that Ed Miliband would have to govern with the SNP. That was the assumption. So in those circumstances, you have extraordinary leverage. But when you have a Labour government with a majority of, say, 100, 150, you don't have any leverage. And I wonder what that leads to. I think you might see a small rise in the Scottish Greens. Scottish Tory Party clearly is dying, but there are still lots of Scottish Conservatives. So where do they turn? You've got Alba, which has never really been talked about, but the nationalist vote in Scotland is so big, you have to imagine at some point it's going to fragment beyond just one political party. That tends to be the norm. I know there's the Scottish Greens too, but they don't have any Westminster MPs. So it's an interesting one. I think it's one of those that they need to keep their powder dry. What's the phrase that Alex Salmond loved? Is it right? It's not from Robert Burns, but yeah, tremble, false wigs, in the midst of your glee. You've not seen the last of my bonnets and me. And bonnet is a bayonet. And so, they'll be back is the phrase, although of course they never came back. And that's what happened. The Jacobite uprising, I think it didn't work out, guys. So I imagine the smart voices in the SNP are thinking, hunker down, build a movement, build your youth wing, deep organising, cultural organising, build policy. But I look at John Swinney, I don't see that. There are huge debates within Scotland about this stuff, right? And the SNP made a very conscious decision after 2014 not to build a mass movement.
Let's move on to foreign policy and defence, because this is actually one area where the SNP really does stand out from the Tories and Labour and the Lib Dems too, I believe, but you may have to check me on that, is that they say that they want to scrap Trident and reinvest the money into conventional defence and public services. Now, that's something which the Labour Party they haven't committed to scrapping Trident in any manifesto since 1984, all right? But that's always something that...
83.
Sorry, 83, sorry. They haven't wanted to scrap Trident since 1983, but it's always been a stick with which Corbyn was beaten. So Labour have come out very, very pro-nuke. Another thing which for me seems very notable within the Labour Party manifesto is that they say the UK's military, financial, diplomatic and political support for Ukraine will remain steadfast. They have not attached a monetary figure to that. So you're talking about a fully costed manifesto, but you're saying, all right, we are going to keep shoving money and aid towards Ukraine. And that might be the right thing to do, but it's not so fully costed then. No.
And it's the same with spending 2.5% of GDP on defence, which, by the way, the Lib Dems are also saying, the Tories are also saying, 2.5 doesn't sound like a big number. It's, I think, in reality, something like £10 billion. It's a huge number. Look, we could talk all day about Ukraine. I think that the idea that you just sign blank checks to a foreign country because it gets lots of hashtags and lots of, even if you care deeply about stopping the Russian bear and you think it's existential, et cetera, there have to be red lines around what you're paying and what you're not paying for. The idea that we will pay whatever we have to, we aren't, and this is actually something that gets to the heart of the Green Manifesto, we aren't a rich country anymore. We aren't that rich. And it's the Greens are saying that they want to spend 1% on foreign aid. We're not that rich. Okay, I would love the UK over a long period of time to spend more money on foreign aid to help the global south. We need to reindustrialize this country first. We need to, and that's not looking after, we need to create wealth in this country first. I think that's the one thing Labour really get right, is that the wealth creation thing has to come first. Now, I would say wealth creation is partly an outgrowth of redistribution because the wrong people don't have the money to buy the goods and services we want to produce. But implicit in that Labour recognition around Ukraine is that we're still really rich. And I find that actually that's what irritates me the most with the Green Manifesto. But on this, like you say, it's so conspicuous because Labour on everything else is saying, look, we're not a rich country anymore. We need to be like Singapore in the 60s, startup nation mentality. But on this, give Zelensky the billions and billions and billions and billions, no questions asked. Come on. We can't afford to do that. We're not the US.
Interesting bits from reform. Obviously, they want to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by year 3% within 6 years. They are also proposing something which is a bit like a GI Bill, right? Free education both during and after service, vital for a return to civilian life. But let's move on to foreign policy. Now, skeptics will say that this is just to shore up a Muslim and left-wing vote, which has deserted Labour over its handling of Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, but they've promised to recognise a Palestinian state and that no other state should get a veto on the sovereignty of another. What do you make of that?
Well, as I understand it, the position is the same as it was under Ed Miliband. We will recognise it at some future date. Okay, well, what's the date? I did an interview recently with Ilan Pappé here on Downstream. We talked about Labour Friends of Israel. We talked, more importantly, actually, in a way, a Jewish labour movement. These are Zionist organisations, and a Zionist organisation, you can be a Zionist and want the two-state solution. There's not much evidence of that historically. So, and when people say that, it's really just to sort of fob you off and do a bit of sort of PR barricading. I think Labour, you have 78 Labour MPs right now, Labour Friends of Israel. Labour Friends of Israel will not want recognition of the Palestinian state. They won't say that, right? Because they know it's unpopular. That's how they operate. Unlike the left, when the left has unpopular policies, but they say, this, I don't care if it's unpopular, I believe it. The Labour right doesn't do that, right? Luke Akehurst doesn't do that. It's like, what I want is unpopular, so I won't tell anybody, I'll just do it. And this is a classic example of that. So Keir Starmer can say that, Ed Miliband can say that, but when you've got more than a third of your MPs being members of Labour Friends of Israel, not happening. My view, I could be wrong. On lots of this, I want to be wrong.
So for me, the most interesting thing about Labour's foreign policy is, again, something they're not saying, which is after the monstering of Jeremy Corbyn when he was Labour Party leader, they've retreated to a position of saying our foreign policy is whatever Washington is doing. And that seems to me to be a very, very dangerous thing because, one, you look at our complicity with airstrikes on Yemeni targets. Two, you look at how Washington's blanket support for Israel has enabled a genocide which is destabilizing the entire region. And three, I think that it takes us back to that place of having a government who would lead us into a reckless hot war. Now, don't know who, but, could be with somebody. What do you make of that? Do you think it's a particularly popular policy position?
I don't think it's very popular with the sorts of people that would vote reform. And I think the dissident right, as they call themselves, people like Farage, they know their audience very well. I think there's a big chunk of British nationalists or people who feel patriotic who do take umbrage at the idea that we are America's poodle. No, they're the first people that say, I could never vote Labour. Why? Blair and Iraq. Now, that might just be, they might be talking crap, but the fact they say that, I think, is in itself quite instructive. If you look at somebody like Peter Hitchens, who I love to talk to about this stuff, Britain is a vassal state of the US. After 40-41, Dunkirk and the fall of Singapore just happens. We are a vassal state. And it's becoming even worse. I talk about this in a recent interview with Angus Hanson in terms of what it means for our businesses and our tax base and all kinds of things. But we are a vassal state. And I think that's really cutting through to lots of people. Whenever you talk on right-wing media, which I go on GB News, and I'll say, we have our foreign policy in this country written by Washington. It really angers people, and they know it's true. Trident warheads are, so we manufacture the submarines, we manufacture the missiles, but the actual warheads, I believe, maybe the missiles too, but the warheads, I'm pretty sure, maybe we make the warheads. One part of the missile and the warhead has to be serviced in the United States. In other words, it cannot work without the Americans. So the idea that it's an independent deterrent is nonsensical. We basically have politicians again saying, well, look, we'll send infinity money to Ukraine, no questions asked. It's the same with Trident. We will send infinity money, to Trident. And it's a proverbial blank check with regards to foreign policy. Whatever the US wants, we'll do it. I personally don't think a single British national should be killed because of what Israel is doing. I personally don't think that a single British soldier should be in Ukraine if Russia goes to Odessa. I know that sounds horrible, but I just, it's so far away. I don't understand how. And people say, well, look, the left has always cared about human rights and principles, not just about limited national interest. It's not about national interest. It's about what can we do as a country of 68 million people, which actually, we're not the US, we're not China. And I think actually our membership of the alliance with the US has more downsides than upsides. And the US, this is something I really try and talk about a lot. The US is insulated from its mistakes. If it displaces loads of people, if loads of regimes go belly up and actually the wrong people take charge, it has the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, it doesn't care. We're in continental Europe. We've got North Africa to our south. We've got West Asia to our east. So if you're saying, let's make tens of millions of people stateless and are near abroad, then guess what? They're going to start coming to Europe. Or if you're saying we're going to immiserate their economies because we don't like the people in charge of them, guess what? Then radicalism is going to flourish. So the costs of US foreign policy are disproportionately paid for by Europeans and the UK. And I personally, that's something I want to talk about a hell of a lot over the next 5 to 10 years. Corbyn tried to do that and failed, let's be honest. And I think, frankly, you're going to have to talk about it in a much different way for it to cut through. But this idea that, blank check to Israel, blank check to Ukraine, blank check to Washington is nonsensical. The Workers' Party, I find this quite funny, they want a referendum on membership of NATO. That would be probably the most wacky referendum imaginable. It would be fun. Personally, I don't care about whether or not Britain's in NATO. Sorry. But what's interesting is, Ash, 10 years ago, this was all sotto voce. It wasn't politicized. But now Labour has to say, we are the party of NATO. They weren't doing that 10 years ago because this stuff wasn't being challenged, because people weren't seeing, actually, maybe our foreign policy in Iran, in Libya, Israel, free reign, maybe this is actually not good for our country. And so I think, this is a response to that.
I want to move on to climate. And not just because it's incredibly hot in this studio, Aaron. I want to talk about the climate emergency. Now, we mentioned that the Green Party's manifesto promises much more in terms of tax and spend than any other party. But I just want to, put some numbers to it. This is from the IFS. The Green Party has set out a vision which would see the size of the state increase on an unprecedented scale. By the end of the next parliament, they want to increase taxes by over £170 billion per year to fund a £160 billion boost to day-to-day public spending. They also plan to spend an additional £90 billion a year on capital spending, which would be a particularly big increase. Even taking their figures at face value, overall borrowing would end up around £80 billion a year higher. We could expect debt to be rising throughout the next parliament. Now, maybe we disagree a little bit here. I'm not so bothered about the debt to GDP ratio if what you are funding with that borrowing is socially and economically productive. Now, if you're doing that much borrowing for green infrastructure, high-speed rail, insulated homes, there are obvious social benefits, there are obvious jobs benefits, there are obvious wealth creation benefits. I mean, when Clement Attlee founded the NHS, I think that debt was something like 200% of GDP, and no one would look back and go, oh, well, you really should have done the bean counting thing and not founded the NHS. For me, spending on climate very much fits into that category. I think, screw the debt to GDP, do it. It's going to be better for our country in the medium to long term. I suppose, what do you make of the Greens in terms of their climate pledges? What do you make of their spending pledges on climate? And how does that compare to Lib Dems, Labour and Tories? Reform, it's almost not worth mentioning because they really want to declare war on net zero.
Yeah, Reform's green agenda is Farage doing videos wearing a Barber gilet. That's about it, and his black lab in Kent. But it is interesting, isn't it, that the right love this idea of the rural idyll, the aesthetics of conservation. Well, okay, well, what are the political commitments then? If you care about nature and you want to hear thrushes and you want to hear birds that 50, 60 years ago were everywhere, swifts, now they're nowhere because of climate change. If you care about that stuff, then what are the commitments? No, I just want to make a video. Leave me alone. So in terms of what they're saying, I agree with you. I don't have a problem with the Greens spending loads of money on transition. The point is that it can't be deficit funded, or it can be, but within limits. Now, again, I have no problems with deficits, but the point is that Liz Truss, this is the one thing that Labour say which is true, Liz Truss shows you what happens if you go very quickly in a very radical policy direction. Now, that wasn't the markets, by the way. That was the Bank of England that screwed Liz Truss. They would do the same to the Greens, right? That's the point. The deep state would do the same to the Greens. So it'd be a mixture of the bond markets, the Bank of England, influential conservative pundits. They would remove any government that sought to deliver and implement a program like that. So I think it has to be really tax that does it. And to their credit, the Greens have a lot of new taxes. The cornerstone of the Green Party in terms of what they're saying with regards to green the economy is, let me get this up, is here we go. 40 billion investment per year in a shift to a green economy, 40 billion a year, bringing rail, water companies and the big five retail energy companies into public ownership. Very clear, they'll pay through that with tax. Labour's approach to the climate crisis is really quangos and inshallah, which is, we're not going to spend lots of money, but we're going to create lots of institutions, new organisations, new bodies. And I actually like the sound of these, but the critique of quangos, is why I'd get rid of most of them, is that effectively they get packed with political appointees.
If you want to reduce government waste, setting up quangos isn't how you do it.
No. I mean, I'd get rid of lots of quangos. Every time there's somebody, we would create a commissioner for so-and-so. I'm like, no, get rid, afuera. But the thing is, I know whenever people set up quangos, it's always for quangos for vulnerable children, quangos for X, Y, Z. And nobody is against solving those problems, or commissioner for victims. Why do we have a commissioner for victims? We have the CPS, we have the police. They should be looking after victims.
I want a commissioner for villains. And I would be that commissioner.
Yeah, well, putting villains first, and monster raving loony bastards will come like that. So Labour's quangos, as part of their quangos and inshallah, National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority, Industrial Strategy Council, this all sounds good, by the way, enhance the OBR, no, we should scrap the OBR, Great British Energy, National Wealth Fund, and then an Ethics and Integrity Commission. So scrap the OBR, not the Ethics and Integrity Commission, but Great British Energy, National Wealth Fund, Infrastructure and Service Authority, Industrial Strategy Council, all of that stuff would really align decarbonising the economy with industrial policy. I think that's great. That's great. The point is, just doing that, and there is some cash backing it up. National Wealth Fund with 7.3 billion. I think Great British Energy has something like 8 billion. It's something, but it's not going to make a dent. So what's ironic is that the Greens talking about spending 40 billion a year. Oh my God, so much. Well, Labour was saying 26 billion a year until very recently. That's a realistic figure.
I mean, so Labour, of course, at first promised £28 billion a year on green spending. Then they said £28 billion over the course of a parliament. And now when it comes to looking at what's in the manifesto, it's even smaller still. And a lot of that is coming from already existing spending pledges. What's interesting for me about the Greens is that they're talking about raising over £90 billion from taxing carbon emissions. Now, when you move to impact-based taxes, that is going to push the prices of goods and services and certain forms of transport up for everyone, right? I think that's just undeniable. I think the sort of unspoken bit that the Greens are saying is, well, if you take this all as a picture, we're going to have really, really excellent public services. You're going to have really, really great, affordable council housing. And yeah, the cost of consumption is going to go up, but you're rebalancing our economic lives. So you're not filling the hole which has been left by a lack of affordable housing with cheap consumables anymore. We're going to make those very expensive, but we're going to balance it off with your standard of living increasing in these other ways. I understand why no one says that out loud as a picture, but if they did, do you think people would go for it?
Probably not. Probably not. And also, we'd have a lot of inflation really quickly. My politics personally are probably somewhere between what Labour is offering and what the Greens are offering. That's probably because I'm 40, right? If I was a 25-year-old Aaron, I'd be like, yeah, the Greens. I think you can do a hell of a lot in a decade. You can transform the economy in a decade. You shouldn't be worried about 1, 2, 3 years. That first term, you can do so much. So there's stuff, for instance, that the Greens talk about with retrofitting, insulating homes, providing clean heat. They want to invest 29 billion over 5 years to insulate homes to a certain standard, just short of basically passive house. So you don't need really much heating at all. You can absolutely do that in one parliamentary term. You can absolutely do that. And that would be very popular. That will bring down energy bills. It won't impact inflation. So stuff like that, I think is, or the 150,000 new social homes built to that standard, all of that's fantastic. I think, you can sort of overcook the pudding a bit. What I would say is there's some stuff which I think is really positive and actually in a way more radical than spending tens of billions in terms of greening the economy, which, like I say, it would happen in a decade without saying lots of this stuff. Because when you're doing 40 billion a year, you're going to waste lots of money. That's the problem. If you start a business and you have let's say Novara is very efficiently run, right? Because we've grown quite slowly. If somebody said tomorrow, I have 50 million pounds, I want Novara to be massive, we would waste so much money. We don't have a plan to.
You know what? Give us 50 million pounds and we'll find out.
We'd buy a Learjet. No, we wouldn't. We'd buy an electric jet. But the point is, the idea that it's just money that quickly actually often isn't the way. And if you have fewer resources, it means you can make them go further, and it actually makes more sense to incrementally increase budgets. Anyway, I'm sure they get me lots of hate in the comments. That's my view. On rewilding is where I think the Greens are really promising. They want to set aside 30% of land and seas by 2030, where nature will receive the highest priority and protection. Amazing. That is amazing. For me, that's very powerful. On pesticides, an immediate end to the emergency authorization of bee-killing pesticides. Now, why is that salient? Well, in Brighton, where the Green Council got the boot, Labour are back and they're using Roundup, which is a pesticide which actually has a massive impact on bees, and it's one of many pesticides which is a culprit in the declining bee population in this country. So I look at Brighton Labour. Are these people really that serious about the climate crisis? On a very micro level, tiny thing, you can do all the quangos and all that shit, but if on a local level you're using Roundup and you're getting rid of pollinators, so fundamental to the natural world, I don't really think you're going to do very much. So I really am I'm probably going to vote Green because of things like the rewilding policy, right? And people say, well, we're only 1% of the world. What does it matter about our CO2 emissions? Well, that's a collective action problem, right? Every country can say that. No country is 50% plus of all CO2 emissions. But on stuff like conservation, when you say, well, look, we are one of the most nature-deprived countries on Earth, it would be very good if we could go back to where we were in the 50s, the 40s with regards to the natural world, insects, birds, mammals, maybe even further back, like beaver, 700 years ago. Let's go back to where we were then. That to me is really, that's something that makes me happy and I feel optimistic about is rewilding and renewing certain parts of the natural world.
I suppose I want to end by talking about political narrative. Who do you think is telling a political story which makes sense, that's internally coherent,
great question.
and also, I suppose, bears some reality to the material conditions of this country? For me, the Tories don't have a political narrative, right? What they have is a Hail Mary, right? That's it. It's just, please don't kill me, right? And I don't think it's working. Reform, interestingly, do have a very strong political narrative in that everything that's in their manifesto goes back to one of their key talking points. So even though I think that some of it is fantastical, right? It's just, you've pulled this out of your ass. It's not workable. These numbers are a fiction. It's all leading back into their central stories around national decline, immigration, war on net zero. Very, very relentlessly focused. Labour, they're not really telling a story about themselves. For all the photos of Keir Starmer, and there are many, it's not really a story about how you grow the economy, right? Or what is an ideal level of wealth redistribution? Or when you use a word like fair, are you talking merely about fairness of opportunity? Or are you talking about something more like equality of outcome? All of those things seem really undefined, and they're just trying to plaster a big old photo of Keir Starmer's face to cover it up. Where they're clear is on pinning the Conservative Party. And it's a curiously apolitical and deeply technocratic critique. You're chaotic, you're incompetent, you're wasteful, you don't know how to make decisions. The Lib Dems are attempting, in my view, a reinvention. They're trying to say, we're not the austerity handmaids anymore. We know that we helped make life completely unbearable for many disabled people, but we're not like that anymore, I swear. The Greens have taken on much of Corbyn's platform. They were against it at the time, and now they've got all those lovely disaffected Corbynistas to pitch to. They're borrowing his clothes, shall we say. And the SNP, in a different way, I think suffers from a similar problem to the Conservatives. They don't know how to manage being both insurgents in Westminster, but having a record in office that people can and are pointing to. So for me, the two parties which are struggling most with, here's a clear political narrative, it's the Tories and the SNP.
I would say, before I respond to that, every party has some good policies, right? So, Aaron, what the hell are you talking about? The Lib Dems, and I was like going through and I go, this is a really great policy. The Lib Dems want a national scheme like a young person's rail card for buses, young person's bus card. Great, why don't we do that already? That's so easy, so obvious. Reform, they want to scrap interest on student debt. Fine, great, I love that idea. And that's not radical, right? So again, it's something that you think, it almost shows the poverty of ambition with Labour. Keir Starmer saying he can't scrap student debt, can't scrap tuition fees. Okay, scrap the interest rates, right? First, or fix it at 1%. Say, no, it's not going to be variable like it has been in the past. You've got Lib Dem reform there, like I say, obviously Greens, take your pick, £15 minimum wage. You've got Labour, like I say, some of those quangos are good. So all the parties have something good about them. In terms of a coherent whole, I do agree. I think actually you're doing it a service to the Conservatives. They have a coherent whole, which is we'll get rid of taxes or we'll cut taxes. You know, front and centre is this national insurance contributions will fall. But you can't cut taxes if the economy is not growing. This is the problem they've sort of worked out. And this is encapsulated for me in this bizarre line. They say by 2029, the deficit will be 3%. That's our target. In 2010, you said you'd get rid of the deficit by 2015. Okay? So 19 years after you first promised to eliminate the deficit, 19 years, you're saying it'll only be 3%. That is a snapshot of how Britain hasn't had a growth model for 20 years. Like, it's very rarely that you see something so crystal clear like that. So you can't just have your default of being cut taxes and it'll get growth when you've been doing that and it hasn't happened. People say, well, the taxes are very high. No, 2010 to 2015, the first things they did, reduce corporation tax and reduce the top rate of tax. It didn't make any difference because as the centre-right is gradually beginning to learn, you don't just cut taxes and automatically you get a booming economy. It doesn't work like that. If that was the case, then California and Japan wouldn't be the world's global innovation hubs. Malta would be because it's got corporation tax of 5%, not 35%. Anyway, so I think that there is an integrated message with the Tories, but it's just been found out for a very long time. They've not come up with a new one. Like you say, I think Reform as well have one. Labour is like Quango's trust us and inshallah. It's our turn. The Greens have a very integrated message. We're going to spend a shitload of fucking money to, transition the economy. And I think, interestingly enough, you've got Reform. They have a growth model. They're saying we've got the petty bourgeois. We'll cut your taxes. We'll help the high street. We'll put you guys first. Small business has been let down by the Tories for too long. When they talk about business, they mean multinationals, by the way, which is true. And you have the Labour Party who have a growth model. Basically, Keir Starmer has a nice haircut and will reduce planning regulations. The Green Party don't have a growth model. And you need a growth model. And it's like it's waiting there. You're talking about a different kind of economy, post-carbon, you're talking about rewilding. Okay, well, maybe like tourism could be a thing. I said earlier on, each party has one good policy. The Lib Dems talk about Minister for Tourism. Why the hell don't we have that already? We don't have somebody pitching tourism like as their job. I find that insane. Personally. So there's coherence with regards to those parties, with the exception of the Greens on growth. The Lib Dems, like you said, it's just meh. And, there was a poll out today putting the Lib Dems on less than 10% of the vote,
Oof.
which is interesting because that's lower than 2019, but of course they'll get many more seats. And in a way, Ed Davey's inability to break through, given everything, I think is really interesting. And the fact that the Greens sort of regularly just behind the Lib Dems, I think that to me is one of the more heartening stories of this election. If the Greens can get 4 seats, famous last words, they might end up with 0. If they can get 4 seats, that would put such a huge smile on my face. Because I think if Labour get a majority, the Tories collapse, and you have a party, which is the left of Labour, which supports proportional representation, I think that sets things up really well for the next 10 years.
You have forgotten to mention, in what is otherwise a very comprehensive roundup of the manifestos, Aaron, our favourite policy.
What's that?
Labour promises to make this country the best country in the world to be a football fan, which, when we were off camera, you said would mean legalising violent disorder.
Well, violent disorder was introduced partly because of the miners' strike, but also because of football firms in the 80s. They were so fucking violent. Which, violent disorder, if people are not aware, it's, I think, if there's 3 or more people, would induce in a stranger, it's incredibly abstract, induce in a stranger feelings of alarm or distress. So it's incredibly easy to get people on the hook for violent disorder.
I mean, look, this is something which gets...
I don't want it legalised, by the way, please.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, there is such a thing as joking in the Novara media office. So you have a 3-strike rule. You're allowed 3 jokes and then you're fired. But one of the things that makes football culture more exciting about other countries is that it's just less sanitized. And sure, the last thing I want is to be racially abused by like some Millwall supporter somewhere. But I like flares. I like the non-racist ultras firms. And, a little bit of violent disorder is a treat.
Are you like, Tamar Hassan in Football Factory? Are you like him? You know who I'm talking about?
I have watched Football
the Turkish
Factory.
guy.
Yes,
He's like, how does it feel, Bill, to buy Coke off a Turk? Are you like that? I'm watching it on the Sundays.
You know what? I need a Harrington jacket and then we'll see.
Well, some racist you are. You listen to your podcast from a Bangladeshi. That's going to be you. In like 5 years watching the kids play football.
I do it. No. Anyway. Sorry about that, Mum. I don't even know what I was doing. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us for a comprehensive manifesto deep dive.
My pleasure. And also, by the way, just for football fans, we'd obviously have to scrap VAT on Stone Island. That would make football
Great again.
football fans very happy.
My God, they should get you in to write the manifestos, Aaron. You get one policy for every major party.
One stupid policy for every party. There you go.
A smart policy. This has been Novara Media's Manifesto Deep Dive. I hope it's been informative and maybe a tiny bit entertaining. Tiny bit. Why don't you tell us who you're voting for in the comments? And has anything that we've talked about today changed your mind?